the library this afternoon. My name is Renee, and I'm glad to see you here today. I'd also like to welcome those of you who are joining our program via live stream. We're delighted to have Eric Fuselier here to discuss winter botany. Even during the winter months, trees, shrubs, and woody vines provide us with plenty of clues to identification. Eric will teach us about these clues and how, even during the winter time, botany can still be a fun way to spend time outdoors. Eric is an environmental scientist at Olsson, where he works with civil engineers and landscape architects to minimize the environmental impact from the infrastructure projects they design. Eric is currently vice president of the Arkansas Native Plant Society. He also serves on the National Board for Wild Ones, Native Plants, Natural Landscapes. And this is a volunteer nonprofit organization dedicated to biodiversity through the preservation, restoration, and establishment of native plant communities. With that, welcome, Eric. I'm glad to have you back.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Microphone is on. All right. Well, thank you all for being here. Appreciate you coming out, and you hear me ramble on about one of my favorite topics. Am I allowed to take my mask off as a speaker, or okay? I thought that's what we did last time. Okay. Keep it from getting too moist here underneath this mask. So, so winter botany. A lot of people, you think about winter time is not really a time to go outside and enjoy plant life, right? I mean, it's usually pretty bleak. We're outside the growing season for most species. Things have gone dormant. But actually, I mean, there's a lot of things out there going on that we might not normally think about. So it's still a great time of year to go out. A little bit of definitions here. What are we talking about when we talk? Now, some people you might hear refer to astronomical winter, and that's going to be, where the Earth is in its rotation around the sun, right? It's the winter solstice to the vernal equinox, December 21st to March 20th. Then there's meteorological winter. This has to do more with the weather, climate, and this is just basically defined as the coldest part of the year. Around here, we would typically say December 1st to towards the end of February, but we all know that last December felt a lot more like summer or early fall. It's pretty warm. And then January hit, and then bam, snow, ice, But so when we talk about winter here with winter botany, I'm speaking more about the period outside of the growing season. What is the growing season? This is the period, part of the year when plants can grow successfully. And that kind of varies geographically. The growing season up north is going to be much shorter than the growing season further south. If you go up to Alaska, they have a shorter growing season. The last frost happens later in the spring. First frost comes earlier in the fall. Down here, we have a little bit longer growing season. So, for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to refer to winter as that period outside of the growing season in a typical year. Now, a typical year is becoming more less typical each year, but generally, let's just call it November through February. Typically, November is when the trees lose their leaves, or at least late October, and then usually after February, starting in March, you start to see things kind of wake up. All right, so evergreen species. These are pretty easy, especially for beginners when it comes to winter botany. These are going to be the trees, shrubs, plants that stay green throughout the year. And I included this little quote from John Muir, one of my favorites: "Between every two pines is a doorway to a new world." But we're going to go over some of the more obvious evergreens. Of course, shortleaf pine. That's going to be the main native pine here in the Ozarks. You see loblolly pines planted around here. But their native range is typically further to the south. When it comes to what was here before contact or European contact, the shortleaf pine is going to be the main pine that we have here. And of course, it has these evergreen leaves, pine cones that we're all pretty familiar with. Then there are eastern red cedars, Juniperus virginiana. Now, this species is dioecious. Interesting thing. Dioecious meaning two houses. Monoecious species have the male and female flowers on the same plant or as part of the same flower. Dioecious species means that some of the cedars are going to be male, some are going to be female. That's why you only see some cedars have the juniper berries, because those are the female cedars. Other cedars don't have juniper berries. They produce the pollen. Those are the male cedars. So that's something to keep in mind when you're out in the wild there. And then there's another species in the same genus as Juniperus virginianus. This is Juniperus ashii, ash juniper or rock cedar. This is more common in glades, rocky habitats. It's much more common in the desert, dry areas of Texas, and then there's this big gap in its range, and then you find it up here in northern Arkansas. This picture I took over near the dam on Beaver Lake. If you head out on Highway 62, like you're going out towards Eureka Springs, and you'll see a turnoff to go down to the town of Beaver. Right at that turnoff, there's a lot of these ash junipers along the side of the road as you're driving through there. And you'll notice that they're different from the eastern red cedars in that they have a branching, the trunks branch out, multiple trunks coming out from the bottom, whereas red cedars tend to have one trunk that comes up. These have multiple trunks that kind of branch from the base, and they also tend to have these white splotches on the bark that you don't see on red cedars. Some other evergreens are going to be American holly, Ilex opaca. There are some non-native hollies that you'll see out here as well that can be easily confused for the American holly. There are also other members of the Ilex species that are deciduous, like deciduous holly, Ilex decidua, or winterberry. Produces some great, beautiful red berries, and I have some pictures of that one later. But this is going to be one of the evergreen hollies that you might see out in the wild. Then this one, not quite native to the Ozarks, but is native to North America, southern magnolia, and you do see it planted around here a lot in people's yards. It has these very waxy leaves. Another evergreen, stays green throughout the winter. Produces some very beautiful white flowers, those magnolia flowers. And then yucca. We have a lot of yucca species. A lot of it's been transplanted or brought in from like the southwestern United States, but we do have a species of yucca that's native to here in the Ozarks, Yucca arkansana. But these are also a native species. And I stuck that in the shrub category. And I don't really know if it's really a shrub, but that was the best description I could find when I tried to look into the internet. It's like, what is this thing? But it does have these green blades, grass-looking blades that come out from the bottom, and then it will send up a stalk, usually in the summertime, that will produce these beautiful white flowers that have a relationship with yucca moths to pollinate them. And yeah, you might also hear this referred to as soapweed. It contains a lot of saponins in the leaves and the roots and the flowers. Some people report a soapy flavor when they forage the flowers. I don't detect that, but other people do. The roots, the Native Americans would mash them up in water, and then you can agitate the water to make it create some suds, and they would use that to wash their hair, clothing, whatnot. Back when I was a young bachelor living in an apartment, I had a bone comb that a friend had given me to separate out the fibers and the yucca leaves, and I would use that and collect yucca leaves and have it on my counter and just comb out the fibers and use the fibers twisted up to make rope and cordage. And then after all's all done, doing that to a bunch of yucca leaves, I noticed this frothy green substance on my counter, and that was the saponins in the leaves there. So now I did better than what maybe some bachelors would do, just call it good. I did, wipe it down and clean it off, but I did consider there just rubbing it in and calling it good, but no, I did a little better than that. We do have some evergreen ferns here in the Ozarks. This is Christmas fern, really common one of the more common ferns you're going to run into out there. Reason it's called Christmas fern is because it is one of the few green things you're going to see in the woods around Christmas time. I think we have okay, it's not showing up there. All right. So each one of these things that comes out of the ground is called a frond when you're talking about fern terminology. And then these little leaflets, these pinnae, if you look on the underside of those, you can tell whether it's a fertile frond or an infertile frond. If it has these little brown dots on the underside, those are called sori or sorus for singular. And that's what produces the spores. These are a very old form of plant. Ferns they arrived on the scene on Earth before plants started creating seeds. So they reproduce using spores. One way you can recognize Christmas fern is this little node here at the base of the leaflet here. You can think of that as the entire leaflet could look like a stocking or Santa's sleigh, if you turn it on its side, or a thumbs up for Christmas is what Kent Bonner told me is a way to remember that one. And then there is marginal wood fern. This likes rich rocky slopes. This one I found out in the Whitaker Creek out in the Upper Buffalo Wilderness area. That's the hollow Hawksbill Crag or Whitaker Point sticks out over. But if you hike up that hollow up from near Compton Double Falls, that area, I think there's another falls in there too, or several actually. There's some rocky outcroppings with some marginal wood fern. A very beautiful looking fern, and also evergreen. Here's a picture of the sori on the underside of that frond. So that was a fertile frond, and each of these are where the spores come from. Then cutleaf grape fern. This is an evergreen fern that you'll see often in the wintertime. And you can distinguish it from rattlesnake fern, which also produces this interesting looking part here. So they look very similar structurally, but whereas cutleaf grape fern produces this in the late summer, rattlesnake fern produces that in the spring. So it's different times of year when you see those. So otherwise, they can look very, very similar to each other. Then purple stem cliffbrake. This one likes to grow out of cracks and rocks. Those spores are pretty fine, like powdery, and they can get deep in these little cracks. So another evergreen that you might see in the wintertime. Has this little purple stem to it. Looks a little purplish dark. This photo was taken out at Devil's Eyebrow Natural Area in Benton County. Oh no, I'm sorry, at the Rob and Melanie Walton Preserve, also in Benton County and adjacent to Devil's Eyebrow Natural Area. Then we have resurrection fern. This photo was taken out at Lost Valley. This is one that you commonly see growing on the live oaks further south of here. We don't have live oaks up here in the Ozarks, but this is a common one to see growing on live oaks where live oaks grow. But this was growing on a rock out at Lost Valley, and it's called resurrection fern because it will dry up and die, and then as soon as it gets some moisture, it comes back to life, resurrects. And we have various bryophytes that are green. A lot of our mosses are going to be green in the wintertime. These bryophytes, the mosses, are non-vascular plants, so most of them don't have vascular tissue that transport water, and then most of them don't have the ability to stand up on their own, but some you will notice do. Here is pincushion moss. You see a lot of this out at the Bear Hollow Natural Area near Ozark Natural Science Center. It's an interesting one. It has this rounded, looks like a pincushion just sitting on the ground. When you pick it up, you'll notice the underside will looks dead like that. If you put it back down, as long as you have it good contact with the soil, it's going to be fine. Even if you put it upside down, then the new underside will turn into that. So it does well. It's pretty versatile, handles disturbance pretty well as long as it maintains that contact with some moisture. Found throughout the Ozarks. Scouring rush, Equisetum hyemale, and this is technically not a rush. This is related to horsetails. Who has ever seen a fossil of a lepidodendron, one of those ancient scale trees that used to grow here? My wife is raising her head because she knows I have a collection of them. But yeah, those were, this is one of the few surviving members of the Equisetae family, which are these giant horsetails. And back during the Carboniferous period, these things would get to be the size of trees. They would be 60 feet tall, have these large trunks. They call them scale trees because they had these scales all up the side of them. They're another primitive form of plant that reproduces with spores. That's how we know that they're not true rushes. Rush reproduces with seeds. It's a graminoid like grasses and sedges. But these like growing wet areas. You see them a lot along streams and whatnot. And they seem to be used more and more in landscaping. So, found throughout the Ozarks. There are different species of these, and one of the ways you tell the difference is going to be based on the color of these little nodes here. I think there's 2 main species in this area. All right, grasses, poverty oaks. This has always been one of my favorites because it produces these dried up curly little blades. When the blades die off and they dry up, they turn into little curls. So they look like a little tuft of curly hair there on the ground, especially if you see a lot of them growing in one area. It just looks like a bunch of curly grass. But yeah, it's a cool season grass, so it does have the green blades in the wintertime. And speaking of other cool season grasses, the wild rye, we have several native wild rye. So these do not produce their seed heads until the spring. What they do is they exist as a bunch or tuft of grass on the ground, green throughout the winter, much like fescue would. And then in the spring, late spring, early summer, they produce their flowers and seeds, and then they've ended their annual cycle. The other class of grasses that you won't normally see this time of year are the native warm season grasses, and those grow throughout the growing season and then produce their flowers and seed heads late summer, early fall. But we have Virginia wild rye, Elymus virginicus. There's Canadian wild rye, Elymus canadensis, and you'll notice the difference in the seed heads. If you're come across these in the spring, early summer, you'll notice that the seed heads on Canada wild rye droop over, whereas on Virginia wild rye, they tend to stand up straight. Then there's bottle brush grass. If anyone has had a baby and a bottle-fed baby with the bottle brush, you'll see why they call it a bottle brush grass. It's also a cool season grass in the same genus as the wild rye, Elymus hysterix. And then even our cacti will stay green throughout the winter. They can handle the cold. A lot of times when you see them in the wintertime, they're real shriveled up. They don't look like they're too healthy, but they do just fine. They get through the winter and then they perk back up when it warms up. So our main type of cactus we have here, eastern prickly pear, Opuntia humifusa. It's a picture of that. You'll see it a lot in glades, glady areas. Glades are these open rocky areas that almost have like a desert microclimate. And they're on the south and west facing slopes, so they get a lot of sun. And you can a lot of times tell where a glade used to be if you see these growing underneath cedar thickets, because cedars are glade invaders. There's some trails out at the Ozark Natural Science Center with some cedar thickets and these cacti growing underneath them. All right, woody vines, smilax or greenbrier, common one that you'll still see with its leaves on during the winter time. They're not growing, but they're still they still got the leaves, and sometimes you'll see these berries growing on them if they haven't been eaten by the birds. This one is a common greenbrier, Smilax rotundifolia. And we have other species of smilax growing here, but this is a common one you'll see. Then, of course, mistletoe. We have a lot of native mistletoes. Not all mistletoes are native. Some are invasive. They are hemiparasitic, but they're also very important for some bird populations. So when all the leaves are off the trees, that's a good time when you'll start spotting mistletoe. Then there are some native orchids out there that have green leaves. This is rattlesnake plantain. It is a tract species here in Arkansas. And there's some of this growing out in the upper Buffalo Wilderness area. If you take the K Park Cemetery access out towards Bower Hollow Falls, there's some in that area. But you notice the veination has this like netted pattern to it, real light with a dark green leaf. Another common orchid you'll see is putty root, also known as Adam and Eve orchid. What happens is this develops a single basal leaf in the fall that persists throughout the winter, and then when spring rolls around, it flowers. But if you walk around, you see this out there, you'll know that you have come across a patch of putty root, common in the wintertime. Well, not common, but you'll see it in the wintertime. All right, so what about deciduous species? If we don't have the leaves, what do we do? How do we tell what tree it is or what shrub it is? Well, there are other clues that we look for. These can include the bark. I like black cherry. On the young branches or young trunks, you'll notice has these horizontal lines. These are called lenticels. these white lines. As the tree grows and the bark will kind of break up into different plates, you'll notice that each plate still has these little white lines in them, so you can still learn to recognize it as an adult. But these lenticels are there to facilitate gas exchange. These trees, Prunus serratina, produce some tiny little black cherry fruits that do contain cyanide. So I wouldn't eat them raw, or at least in large quantities. Some people do collect them and make jam, and during the cooking process of warming it up, cooking it down, it breaks down the cyanide so that they're able to then consume it. There's some other species like honey locust that provide some clues without leaves. If you see a tree that has these gnarly looking thorns growing out of it, that's a honey locust. Don't step on one of those. If they fall to the ground, sometimes branches fall on the ground. Those thorns are coming out of the branches. They will go right through the sole of your boot. I've learned that twice out there in the field. I've stepped on some without realizing where I was at or what I was within. And they'll poke the bottom of your foot. There's supposed to be some sort of toxic or poisonous compound in there. A gentleman earlier today on a winter botany hike I was leading said that he had one sticking to his calf and it turned his whole calf purple. I haven't personally had a reaction like that, but I have had a little sore spot on the bottom of my foot where it poked me, and that sore spot stuck around there for about a week. The natives would use these as fish hooks. They're pretty sturdy thorns. They're not easily broken. I mean, you can break them off, but once they're off, they have these barbs at the bottom. They're great for primitive fish hooks. And they think that the reason this tree produces these thorns is to ward off megafauna that are no longer around. So mastodons are thought to have browsed on the bark of these trees. These thorns start growing from the tree where there has been damage or nicks to the bark, and they've done studies to look at statistically what height on the tree do they produce the most of the or most thorns or greatest number, and they found that they tend to do that at the same height of mastodon heads. So one hypothesis or theory is that these are producing these for some megafauna that have since gone extinct, similar to the way acacias produce thorns to kind of ward off elephants that are trying to browse on their bark and twigs. Then there are trees like hackberries or sugarberries. These are two separate species. They produce these little knobs on the bark. Here's one up close in the upper left-hand corner. The bark can look pretty similar. When it's young, sometimes these little warty knobs can be spaced further out, but as a tree trunk gets older, they get closer together. One way that you can tell the difference between these species, because we happen to live here in the Ozarks where the range of these species overlaps. So one way you can tell the difference is by the leaves. The edge of the leaf of the hackberry is serrated like a hacksaw, whereas sugarberry tends to be more entire or smooth on the edge. Another way that you can determine the difference is where it is on the landscape. Here in the Ozarks, hackberry is more of an upland species. Sugarberry likes moisture soil. It's found usually in lower areas. It has a different, what we call a wetland indicator status rating. So sugarberry is rated as a facultative wetland species. Hackberry is rated as, I believe, a facultative upland species. All right, then there are some that have these blocky bark patterns. One of those is going to be your persimmon. Commonly, you'll notice the bark is kind of broken up into these little blocks. So other than persimmon, another species that has this is flowering dogwood, Cornus florida. I like to call these alligator trees. They look like alligator scales, and they often have moss growing on them, which gives it kind of a green color. These are the species that produce these pretty white dogwood flowers around April usually. And then the third genus that has a blocky pattern is going to be our viburnums, like our rusty blackhaw. These are the species that produce these white flowers, usually in May, usually an umbel shape, and then or an umbel structure. And then they will produce these fruits, which I'll go into, I think, here in a little bit, in the late summer, fall, that will shrivel up on the plant. Foragers like to call these wild raisins because they can be eaten right off the plant. It's like a shriveled little raisin. but they're technically not grapes. Ozark chinkapin. Now this is one that gets commonly confused because it has leaves that look very similar to some other species. Like some people see a chinkapin oak, which does have leaves that look similar to an Ozark chinkapin. That's why it's called a chinkapin oak, but it has more oak-like bark. This is Ozark chinkapin bark. This is a species a friend of mine discovered two out in a remote part of Washington County. And they do produce the chinkapins, and we collect them each year for the Ozark Chinkapin Foundation. They, best we can tell, are blight resistant. My understanding is we collected some leaves, have sent those off also to the Ozark Chinkapin Foundation. And then they've also developed a new way to test the actual chestnuts for blight resistance. So I haven't heard the results yet, but they're going to be looking at these two trees specifically to see if they had those genetic resistance to the chestnut blight. So, yeah, not oak bark, has this blotchy white and gray and dark gray and black pattern. Also has these vertical fissures in the bark. So, another commonly mistaken tree for Ozark chinkapin is the Chinese chestnut, which is planted a lot in town as a landscaping tree. They also produce edible chestnuts. One way that you can tell the difference between the Chinese chestnut and the Ozark chinkapin is a Chinese chestnut's typically going to have 3 to 5 nuts within each burr, and Ozark chinkapin usually just has 1. Occasionally you'll see 2. I've only ever seen 1 chestnut per burr. And also the Ozark chinkapin nuts are much, much smaller than the Chinese chestnuts. And there's also a difference in the leaves as far as how the teeth come off the edges. Chinese chestnut has more of a wavy pattern with the pointed part coming off, whereas Ozark chinkapin has more of a serrated pattern along the edge. If you go to the Ozark chinkapin's website, they have a great section on there that helps you learn how to differentiate the different Ozark chinkapin lookalikes. Then American sycamore. This is the one that's pretty easy to recognize in the wintertime because the bark, especially the older bark, starts to exfoliate, come off the tree, and reveals this light white inner bark. So a lot of times you might have to look up high in the tree to see that, but on the older trees it starts to do that lower down on the trunk. And then shagbark hickory. This is one of our hickories. There's an obviously called shagbark because the bark peels off in these long strips, pretty shaggy. There's another hickory that does this called shellbark hickory, and that one does not grow here in this part of the state, but it does grow in other parts of Arkansas. But as far as the Ozarks here, shagbark hickory, if you're seeing that bark pattern, that's what you're looking at. Then there's river birch. This is another tree that has the bark exfoliate off. Different than the white birches that you might see up north. This is our native birch here in Arkansas. And yeah, it has these long or papery kind of shredded exfoliating bark pattern. So another great species to use in landscaping. Has that winter aesthetic because of the bark, and it's also great for wildlife. Then American beech. Has a very smooth bark, occasionally with these bumps. So this is one that you commonly see. It's a late successional species, so you normally see this in areas where the forest has not been disturbed in several decades, and it's allowed to go through its different successional stages to reach the late successional area. So out towards the Buffalo is going to be the best place to go find some beech trees. Then there is winged elm. Now this has these woody little wing growths that grow along the stems. There are other elms that grow elsewhere, not here, that do this. Cedar elm does that. Cedar elm typically loses those wing growths as it gets larger. Sweet gums will also have that, when they're young, will have this woody growth, but as they grow larger, the sweet gums will lose that also. Another way to tell the difference between a cedar elm and a winged elm, if you're, say, down in Texas where cedar elms are more common, is that cedar elms produce their seeds in the late summer, early fall. Winged elm produces their seeds in the spring, along with slippery elm and American elm. All right, so what about twigs? Let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of a twig. So this is kind of pointing out different parts. Notice how this has little spots on here. These are the lenticels. Remember, these help facilitate gas exchange. Leaf scars. These are going to be very helpful when trying to determine a species in the wintertime. This is where the last year's leaf grew from and then fell off. We have these lateral buds that come off. This is going to be next year's leaf. Then we have the bud scale scar. This was the terminal bud, which you can't see it on here, but off screen there's a terminal bud. That's at the very tip of the twig. So if you take the terminal bud and you go down the twig and find the bud scale scar, that's where the terminal bud was the previous year. So what you would see here would be all the previous year growth over the last growing season. And so at the end of that growing season, the new terminal bud would look much more closer to a bud scale scar. So there are 3 leaf arrangement patterns, and this is where the leaf scars are going to be helpful. Alternate, as you'll see here, this is where the leaves kind of come off the stem in an alternating pattern. You get one coming off here, go further up, another one comes off, go further up, another one comes off. An opposite leafing pattern, you have 2 that come off at the same part of the stem, opposite of each other. The most common type you'll run into in the wild is going to be the alternate leafing pattern. Now, opposite leafing pattern is less common, and then what's even less common than opposite is going to be the whorled leafing pattern. That's where you have 3 or more leaves coming off the same part of the stem. So if you look at the bud scars and where they are in relation to each other, you can determine whether a species is an alternate leafing pattern species or a opposite, or less commonly a whorled leafing pattern. If you find that you have, some of our common alternate leaf species are going to be our oaks, hickories, birch, and beech. Okay, forgot how this was set up. All right, so we're going to go into some alternate leafing pattern. This is black walnut. Notice this little alien face here. That's the leaf scar. Looks almost like a praying mantis smiling at you. These dark spots, what you're seeing, that's where the xylem, phloem left some scars there. You see the lateral bud coming off the top. So keep in mind, too, that black walnut is a compound leaf, produces a compound leaf. So when that leaf grows, it will have its own leaf stem and multiple leaflets coming off of it. One way you can tell when you're seeing a tree when it has its leaves on it, whether you're dealing with a simple leaf or a compound leaf, is, let's go back to here. Let's just pretend this opposite leaf pattern here, let's just pretend that's a compound leaf. Down here at the base, you will see a little node growing where the base of the leaf stem meets the branch. You will not see that little node growing out here at the base of each little leaflet. So if you look at it and you say, okay, there's no nodes here, but there's one down here, then you know this entire thing is the leaf. It's a compound leaf, and at the end of the growing season, that entire thing will fall off. So hickories produce compound leaves. Black walnuts, they're all in the same family. And then this is next year's. That's what the node would look like, and then it becomes a lateral bud, which then later grows into a leaf. Mockernut hickory, another common one here in the Ozarks. Carya tomentosa. All right, so what about some opposite leaf patterns? Now here, we're talking about the maples, ashes, dogwoods, honeysuckle family, and the buckeyes. And there's a little saying that you can remember all that with, madcap horse. Now, of course, the mad is pretty easy, maple, ash, and dogwood. Honeysuckle, you got to go to like the genus for that, Fuselier. So little loop there. And then the horse, some people call buckeyes horse chestnuts. So if you remember madcap horse, that's going to help you if you come across a twig that has leaf scars that are opposite of each other. You know you've narrowed it down to one of these. Now there might be a few that are less common, I believe like American bladdernut, which then again I think that might also be in the honeysuckle family. I have to look that one up. But there are some, but as far as these are going to be your main opposite leaf pattern species. So silver maple. Notice we got two buds coming off here. There's one here, and the other one's, I would assume, on the other side of that twig where we can't see it. But once you get familiar with the leaf buds, you'll start to notice that even they have their own look to them. Sugar maple. And I think these are called bud scales. So sometimes you look at these, you see these little scales on there. Red maple often has that red color to it. So you can see this had the terminal bud last year, and you see that little bud leaf scar, and then now it's growing, and then these are now the terminal buds. Green ash. Now this is one that you might commonly run into, and the way you can tell green ash from white ash is you see this lateral bud is more impressed into the bud scar for white ash, so it has more of a smiley face shape to it, whereas in green ash doesn't have that. It's not as impressed into it. So when you're out in the wild, you know you have an ash species, which are the two main ones you'll find here in the Ozarks, are green and white. You can look at the leaf bud scar and tell the difference there. Another way you can tell the difference between white ash and green ash is green ash is going to like mesic conditions or moist soil. White ash likes more upland conditions, drier soil. So landscape position, just like the sugarberries and the hackberries. And here's just a photo I've seen getting passed around Facebook and social media, just kind of show some of our more common twigs and how they look. Beech here, where are we at? Right here. You'll notice if you're hiking around the winter time, be careful. If those things poke you in the eye, they poke you in the eye. All right, so what about some buds? Like this, you all might see these little buttons on the tips of some of the dogwood branches, and those are next year's flowers. So what we see here on the outside, they don't look like it now, but that's actually what turns into what we think of as the white petals of dogwoods. They technically aren't petals, but as these things grow, they start to grow in the wintertime. They sit there on the tree, and then when it starts warming up, they'll start to open up and bloom, and they will turn white, and then the true flowers are in the center of the dogwood flower. Here's that little eye sticker there for the American beech. There's some waterfalls out near Magnolia Falls where you got to be careful when you're kind of going through this beech thicket, because they're right there at eye level. All right, some other clues like leaves on the ground. Maybe you have a tree, you're not quite sure what it is. Maybe it's alternate leaved. Maybe you narrowed it down to a few different genuses. You're not quite sure. Sometimes the leaves on the ground can give you some clues. Sometimes they can help rule things out, or they can kind of add some supporting evidence to what species you're dealing with. Keep in mind, leaves get blown around, so, but yeah, you might find other things on the ground too, whether it be walnut husks or hickory husks. If you find a hickory nut on the ground, sometimes the shape of that hickory nut can tell you what species of hickory you're dealing with. All right, another thing I want to talk about is leaf marcescence. These are where the trees retain their leaves through the wintertime. You'll notice this is pretty common with beech trees, a lot of our oaks, especially the white oak group, and sugar maples. And they retain those leaves so that they can protect their leaf bud through the winter, through the cold. And then next spring, as the new leaf starts to grow, it'll shed that leaf, and then a new leaf will grow coming up behind it. So here's some beech. They tend to be a little lighter color. They can be a more brown color, but if you hike around the Buffalo River this time of year, especially when the leaves are all off, you can definitely tell where there's a grove of beech trees. And then there's sometimes you see the fruits, sometimes on the ground. Who's seen one of these on the ground? Yeah, Osage orange, also known as a hedge apple. People used to take these, also known as bodark trees, and use them, plant them as hedgerows. So you can, the technique that I've read about has been that you collect these Osage oranges, and then you can put them in a bucket of water and let the water, leave it outside, let it go through some freeze-thaw cycles, break down into like a sludge by the time you get to spring, then dig a shallow trench and pour that in there, put a little dirt on top of it, and once those trees start to come up, you can start weaving them into hedgerows. And each year, take the new growth and weave it back in, and you can make a living fence. You know, it provides wildlife habitat, some aesthetic, but you'd also be dealing with probably some hedge apples around there too, but that provides food for wildlife as well, especially birds. Then I mentioned the wild raisins. This is rusty blackhaw. Remember, this is viburnum, one of the types, one of the genuses that has the blocky bark. So this is the fruit that it produces, and they will stay on through winter, early winter or so. You'll see these, they'll be shriveled up and look like raisins. That's why foragers call them wild raisins. Coralberry, commonly confused with American beautyberry. They are in completely different genuses. I'm not sure how they relate as far as the family goes, but the leaves look different. Coralberry has smaller leaves, smooth edges. American beautyberry, larger leaves, different shape, and serrated edges. But they both produce flowers and berry clusters in the axil of the leaves along the stem. So you'll see them in the wintertime with these little clusters of berry growing along stem, except coralberry usually has fewer berries. Beautyberry will often produce larger cluster of smaller individual berries. And beautyberries you usually see are gone, whereas these will often stay on in the wintertime. I've read that they are a winter food source for deer, but just not their preferred food source because they don't taste that great. But coralberry is also a host plant for certain butterfly and moth species, so still important for supporting bird populations because a lot of birds like to feed their young caterpillars. All right, so this is Ilex decidua, another one of our hollies, but this is deciduous holly. Ignore the green cedar leaves down here. This is what is also called winterberry, or possum haw, produces these red berries. This is one that I found out near Lake Leatherwood in Eureka Springs. There's quite a few out there. So the leaves will be off the tree, but these red berries will grow. And it is in the same genus as our American holly, which is our evergreen holly. Cornus florida, when the leaves are off the trees, you can sometimes see these red droops. And it says the botanical term for this type of fruit is a droop. So that can kind of let you know if you're dealing with a dogwood. Maybe you see the scaly, blocky bark, and you see these droops on there. Maybe you see some of those buttons that are going to turn into next year's flowers. And there you go. You put that together and know you got a flowering dogwood. All right, so what about the nuts? Well, oaks produce acorns, and you can get to know the acorns really well to kind of tell what oak species you're dealing with. Like a bur oak, these are pretty big acorns and produce these big caps. White oak, Quercus alba, is going to have these longer acorns. Cap doesn't take up so much of it. An overcup oak, Quercus lyrata, the cap, these are smaller, more round, and the cap covers more of the actual acorn. And these are all in the white oak group. One way that you can tell the difference between an oak that's in the white oak group versus the red oak group is the white oak group, the lobes have rounded edges. The red oak group have bristles on each lobe. Typically they have pointed lobes, but there are some examples or some cases, there's always exceptions to the rule, right? So blackjack oak does have round lobes with a bristle at the tip of each lobe. So the bristle is really what you're looking for. But for the most part, red oaks are going to have pointed lobes, white oaks are going to have rounded lobes. So here are some examples of red oak. We got Quercus falcata. We have northern red oak, Quercus ruba. Willow oak, Quercus phylos, likes wetter habitats. And has also leaves that look like willow leaves. So they're a little bit different than your typical oak leaf, but they do have a bristle at the very tip. And the hickories, bitternut hickories. They're bitter, that's why they call them that. Mockernut hickories, and then shagbark hickories. There's other hickories like butternut hickory, which I don't believe grows in this part of the state, but it has a much better flavor. So when you're foraging hickories, just keep that in mind. You know you got a bitter nut if you eat it, and you can still eat it. It's not going to kill you, but it doesn't taste great. And then black walnut produces these big green balls. If you're riding around in late fall, early winter, sometimes you'll see trees covered in those. if a branch is covering a road or growing over a road, sometimes you'll see the stains on the road where cars have ridden over the husk, and it has this oil in it, and the road just has all these blotches of spots on there. Sweet gum, these gum balls, a lot of people recognize these right off the bat, but if you see these, you got a sweet gum tree. If you recall, sweet gum is also that species that when it's young, it can still have those woody wings on the stem, similar to wingdam. Sycamore, that's the tree with the exfoliating bark that has the white underbark. These are their seeds. It grows these little balls. Here is one by Ozark Mountain Smokehouse that's covered with them. And these are wind transported. If you kind of squeeze that and kind of pull it apart, you'll notice that each seed has a little tuft of white threads, yellowish threads, and that's what helps the wind carry it, and so they can propagate or spread and distribute. American hop hornbeam. Looks like some hops there. This is one out at Lake Leatherwood. So if you see one of these growing off of a understory tree, then you got hop hornbeam, common in the Ozarks. Now here is Ozark chinkapin. Now this was taken admittedly during the growing season. This is the same tree I had the picture of the bark from. Notice just one nut in each burr. So that's typically what you're going to see with the Ozark chinkapin. I will say if you try to collect any of these off a tree, wear gloves. First year, I did not bring gloves. Year 2 and 3, I brought gloves since we've been collecting these. And then we have some winter flowering species. Now typically flowers, why do trees or plants produce flowers? So it's to attract insects, right? Well, why are they doing that in the wintertime? Here we have Hamamelis virginiana, common witch hazel. It flowers September through December and produces these yellow petals. The other type of witch hazel that we have is Ozark witch hazel. Now notice it produces these red petals, red flowers, and it also blooms at a different time of winter. And whenever the common witch hazel is finishing up, Ozark witch hazel is getting started, January through March. And it likes to grow along streams, wetter areas. Now, again, why do witch hazels produce flowers in the wintertime and not the spring or summer when you have a lot more insects? And that's because they have a special relationship with owlet moths. This is a nocturnal winter moth. It's able to heat itself up, and it's flying around on those cold Ozark winter nights, pollinating these witch hazels. So, pretty interesting. I had no idea until I started looking into it that we had a winter moth here. Fascinating. Red maple. Start to see these flowers usually towards the end of winter, before leaves are on the trees. February is commonly seen through March. So you might start to see these red flowers coming off, and you probably got a red maple. You might also look on the twig and see if you have opposite leaf scars, and that could tell you, that's 2 clues right there that you got red maple. Remember, mad horse cap, sorry. All right, so what about herbaceous species? Herbaceous species, these are plants that do not produce woody tissue like shrubs and trees do. They just produce herbaceous leafy tissue that at the end of the growing season, it dies back to the ground. Herbaceous species can either be annuals or perennials. Of course, all of our woody species tend to be perennials. They live multiple years. Annual species live 1 year. They complete their entire life cycle in a year. They grow from seed. They produce a flower, produce a seed, and then they're done. They die. They tend to be shallow rooted, so they're easier to pull up. That's one way you can tell whether something's an annual or perennial. They also, since they only live 1 year, tend to produce a lot of seed because they want to, kind of like things that are on the bottom of the food chain, frogs or whatever else that get eaten by a lot of things before they reach adulthood. They produce a lot of offspring to ensure their survival. Perennial species often don't flower that first year. They will flower the second, third, or even fourth year. But herbaceous species can be either annual or perennial. If it's perennial, that above ground part will die back in the wintertime. The roots stay alive underground, and then those come back the following year. or produce more above ground growth. Now, if they are have a life cycle to where they are flowering and going to seed towards the end of summer, early fall, you'll often see persistent form of that vegetation persist throughout the winter. And so here, like a purple coneflower, this would be a purple coneflower that produced or went to seed towards the end of the growing season. And so a lot of times you still see it standing here through the winter time with its seed heads. And there's all kinds of species that do that. When you're going around and you see all this, what looks like dead vegetation, those are most often herbaceous species that have that persistent vegetation in the wintertime. Like a lot of our warm season grasses I mentioned that wait until the end of the year, like big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, you'll often see those seed heads stick around in the wintertime. And that helps provide a winter food source for birds and other wildlife that are trying to make it through those winter months. Here is seed box, one of our species of Ludwigia. This is a common wetland species, but you'll notice the seeds have this box form. This is Ludwigia alternifolia. And it's a pretty cool one if you ask me. Then we have wood oats, Chasmanthium latifolium. Some people call these inland sea oats. There's different species of Chasmanthium around here, but this is a really common one. Another common name I've seen these called is called fish on a line, because they look like fish dangling off of a fishing pole. This is a really great one for winter aesthetic if you're wanting to plant some of that in your garden. If you have a whole bunch of this, wind blows, all those little seed heads kind of dangle and shimmer all at once, and it's a really cool little thing to watch. Then, of course, everybody knows what cattails look like. They're the hot dogs or the corn dogs you can't really eat, but they do produce this white fluff. Those corn dog looking things, that's the seed head, and it eventually will turn into this white fluff, and then the wind carries those away to land on some other mud flat where they then germinate. And sometimes you'll see some of these milkweed seed heads sticking around. This one still has some seeds dangling, waiting on a breeze to come through and blow it away. But the more familiar you become with a species during the growing season, the more you'll start to recognize it during the winter time when it's just its dead form or its seed head around. Like this is various species of goldenrod. Now this is a little more tricky sometimes to get down to species, at least for myself. Solidago genus, but unless it has a very specific type of growth pattern like blue stem goldenrod does, where it just grows and flowers differently. Typically in the wintertime, I can just get this down to genus without the leaves present. So these are some different goldenrod seed heads. Mentioned little blue stem, one of our warm season grasses. So its growth cycle goes through the warm season, then at the end of the year, right before winter is when it goes to seed. Some broom sedge blue stem. Another one of our Andropogon genuses, which is technically a different genus than little blue stem, but broom sedge blue stem is in the same genus as big blue stem, which is Andropogon gerardii. Here is Elliott's blue stem. Now this grows here, but I took this photo out in Oklahoma. Andropogon gyrans, it has some different way the seeds come off it, just looks different, kind of chaffy. Velvety panic grass, Dicantholium scoparium, another common one when you really get familiar with it. This is also common in wetland areas, also known as deer tongue grass. The Dicantholiums are a common wetland species, and then once you get to know it, you start to recognize it in the wintertime as well. And frost flowers. Technically themselves not plants, but another thing that we see that come from plants in the wintertime. And there are a few species that produce frost flowers. These grow at the base of white crownbeard and yellow crownbeard or yellow wingstem. Now those species will have a more herbaceous, these are herbaceous plants, and they have a herbaceous leafy kind of wing along the stem, not a woody wing like a winged elm does. And then Dittany, which is smaller in the mint family, also will produce these frost flowers. And the reason they produce them is because they have like a pithy center in the stem. And what happens is they're drawing up moisture from the soil. What happens to water when it freezes? It expands, right? Then it kind of breaks through the stem. And then as more water is coming out and freezing, it freezes in these floral kind of patterns. And they can be pretty beautiful. We saw some earlier today. So here's frost flower. This is a white crown beard, Verbicina virginica, also known as frostweed because of the frost flowers. And like I mentioned, the wing stem refers to the stem where you'll see these little green wings on there. So here's a yellow crown beard. Here's a close-up of the stem, kind of showing. It's kind of not easy to tell in this picture, but if you felt it, you would feel it's like a little flap that comes off. But same genus as white crown beard, but just yellow flower, Verbicina alternifolia. Then here's Botany in the growing season, also known as wild oregano. In the mint family, these little leaves, if you pull them off, crush them up and smell them, it's going to smell like oregano. Notice the species names, Oreganoides. All right, for further reading, if you're interested in continuing to study winter botany, I want to give you some books to look into. This one is out of print, Winter Twigs of Arkansas, but you can usually find it in a library or a used copy on Amazon. Some of those out of print books on Amazon go up, they jack up the price, so just keep your eye on it and eventually you'll find one that's affordable. Autumn Leaves and Winter Berries in Arkansas by Carl Hunter, another good one. Winter Botany, another great book. It has drawings on both of these. Neither one of these have photos, but they're still great botanical drawings. And there's Weeds and Wildflowers in Winter. That could help you learn more of the herbaceous species in the wintertime. Another book with a lot of great drawings. And then Woody Plants of the Southeastern United States, a winter guide. So this is going to be better for the woody species. And of course, I'm always happy to answer questions. I need to update that. I was president last year. I'm technically vice president this year. But here's my email. Always happy to answer any questions you might have anytime. So with that, happy to answer your questions here. So, thank you. Anyone? All right, well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it, and appreciate you all listening to me ramble.